Welcome, everyone. My name is Alexa, and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for practical advice for Agile leaders during DevOps transformations with Jeff Payne and Lee Eason.
Good day, everybody. Welcome to Practical Advice for Agile Leaders during DevOps transformations. My name is Jeff Payne. I'm the host of this webinar series. And for those of you that don't know me, I have about 30 years experience building, testing, and delivering software. I run a couple of software organizations, including my current company, Coveros. Coveros is a pure play Agile DevOps engineering company. We help organizations transfer and transition to Agile and DevOps while putting in place the automation and the technical practices needed to make it successful. I'm also the technical editor for Agile Connection, which is an online Agile and DevOps blog and community. I encourage you to join. If you aren't a member, it is free, and you can sign up at agileconnection.com. Really happy today to have a special guest with us. I want to introduce next Lee Eason. Lee, introduce yourself.
So I'm executive director here at IHS Markit. We're a big public company. I say big. We have about 16,000 employees. I've been with the firm for about 4 years now. We were acquired, and so the company I was originally hired with was a little bit smaller in the financial services space. So as a director of DevOps, I was leading a big DevOps transformation here. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes, but I also try to get my time in, doing some writing here and there. You might see me at a conference here and there too. I enjoy kind of getting out in the world and testing ideas and interacting with the community. And so if anybody wants to connect on Twitter, happy to do that. Love having those kind of conversations. And looking forward to the one today with Jeff.
Thanks, Lee. So our Twitter addresses are down in the lower right-hand corner for those that want to follow us there. That's a little bit about us. We are kind of curious to learn a little bit about you and what your primary role is. So I'm going to open a poll to let the audience tell us a little bit about yourselves. Please choose the role that best fits or describes you. If your role is not up there, just please select other and put it in the chat so we know the role you're playing in your organization. Give you a few minutes to, we'll broadcast the results. So everybody should be able to see the results. Yeah, interesting. As you mentioned, Lee, we have one executive here with us, no product owners.
Yeah, that is interesting.
One executive, a few others, testing. Obviously. Great.
Yeah,
well, welcome, everybody. We're going to kick things off today by talking a little bit about what it is we're going to cover during this webinar. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what DevOps is, just for a few minutes, get Lee's perspective on it. I'll give you my perspective. And then Lee's going to jump into a case study, talk about one particular transformation that he was involved in and lesson learned there, and also the importance of the technical improvement process in that regard. Then we're going to dive into a discussion about how Agile leaders can influence DevOps, and in particular, a metrics approach to doing that. We'll talk about some popular DevOps metrics and some pros and cons and what they're good at and what they're not so good at, and then we'll close with some Q&A at the end. So why don't we jump right in? And Lee, you want to talk about, this was your definition you came up with, and I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on how you define DevOps and what it means to you.
Yeah, so it is interesting. Everybody out there that deals with DevOps develops their own kind of definition and understanding of it. A lot of definitions use the word culture. I kind of purposefully took that out of my definition because as I watched the conversations evolve, it became clear to me anyway that I feel like people have very different ideas about what culture is. And so I feel like that word was getting a little overused. It was getting a little bit too muddy. So I wanted to be really, really clear about what I think people are trying to say and certainly what I think about when I talk about DevOps culture. So it really is an environment of reward. Those of you that have read or watched any of Daniel Pink's TED Talks, read his book Drive, or read about incentive and other places, probably this is a familiar concept for you. But people will do what they feel like they're going to be rewarded for doing or what they're incentivized to do. And I think when we talk about DevOps culture, that's really what we mean. We mean that we're in a place where if I'm making investments or I'm spending time on something related to DevOps, then that's a good thing, and I'm not having to fight for that. One thing I see sometimes is development teams having to fight and scrap for any amount of time to spend on technical improvement. That's not a DevOps environment. And you can have all the automation in the world that you want, but if it's almost impossible to change it or improve it or keep it up to date, that's not really a DevOps environment. So it's about balance, and it's about making sure that we're valuing the value that we get out of technical process improvement, fairly, and it's not just getting pushed to the side in favor of features without a real conversation around what that technical process improvement means. And it is really about technical process improvement. I love that the SDLC moniker is coming back into vogue now. I don't know if you've seen that much, Jeff, but I feel like we're seeing this reinvigorating of software development lifecycle, and that's really kind of what we're talking about here, right? We're changing our understanding of the SDLC. It's evolving as it should, but that's to me, that's kind of what DevOps is really encompassing. I don't like. Awesome. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff. I stopped and now I started again.
No, I was just going to say, I like your philosophy there. I love the word habitual. A lot of times we use continuous, which is a good word as well. But I think the word habitual really emphasizes that it has to be, kind of gets back to the principles of Agile and DevOps being about, kind of embodying them, right? Instead of just following them. I love that. And I love, of course, that it's all tied to reward. Right, that we're rewarding people for doing certain things that are important in a habitual manner. Go ahead, you were going to say.
Yeah, I was going to say. Well, I don't know what I was going to say, but I like where we're going with this better. Reward. So let's talk about reward, right, Jeff? What does that mean? I think a lot of times when we hear reward, our head goes to money. But again, if you go back to Pink's research around what motivates people. Where what's the reward come from? Money in creative processes actually slows down the process and decreases quality. And there's been a lot of interesting studies that have been done about this. So I actually don't like using monetary rewards in these types of things. So when I think about reward, most of the time it is individual. Every individual is going to feel motivated a little bit differently, but recognition. It can be as simple as during a sprint review, are you calling out technical improvements and the value that they're bringing in the same light with the same kind of tone that you call out a new feature or a bug fix that is more user obvious or user facing? Those projects, that are improving automation or improving reliability, those things are delivering value, and there are definitely clear ways to talk about those things, but I oftentimes see them in sprint reviews sort of either not get talked about or pushed to the side. It may be like a footnote slide on the sprint review, as if we're sort of scared to talk about technical improvements that we've made, as if we don't want people to know we're spending a lot of time on that, because maybe next time we won't get as much time for it, or they're going to be pushback. Why didn't you get this feature done? I saw that slide with all the bullet points on it. That's not an environment of reward. That's one where we're sort of scared to be honest about what we need to be doing with our product. But a healthy DevOps environment is one where we can call that stuff out. We feel safe doing that, and everybody's sort of on the same page that, yeah, we understand that this team is doing what they need to do, and look at all this great value they've delivered.
That's awesome. I love that definition. One of the kind of images I use, I talk a lot to senior executives, trying to get them to understand what DevOps means and set the right expectations, because I'm sure you can agree, if you don't figure out how to get your stakeholders on and engaged in what you're trying to do, you're probably not going to be successful, because they're not going to understand the value and impact of what you're doing. And I always say that, DevOps is a horrible term because people look at it and oftentimes senior execs think it means, dev and ops working together. And I always use this kind of bookshelf analogy with senior executives, where I say, well, dev and ops are kind of the bookends. There's all sorts of activities, in between those things that have to be done properly. And these are some of them on the bookshelf, from an assurance perspective that we care about. There's many other things we care about. But it's not just about dev and ops. What's your view of that, Lee?
No, I think that's spot on. Something we talk about a lot in the DevOps community is breaking down silos. That's another way to kind of talk about this. And I think really what we're doing is we're recognizing that there isn't this nice, clean division between these sets of responsibilities the way that we would like it to be, right? It's nice when you have a pie chart and there's 3 people that do software development, and there's one person that does QA, and there's one person that does, I don't know, performance testing or something. And then there's this other team over here that's in IT, and they think about reliability. Those of us that are part of the craft understand that that's not real, that those divisions aren't real. And by trying to keep them separated, you're impacting actual throughput and quality. And so I love this image because it's really kind of showing that, hey, really what we're talking about here is we're being honest about the scope of the things that we have to get right to build awesome technical products that the market's going to accept, that's going to be successful in the marketplace. And when we talk about DevOps, we're really just trying to bring those things together in the most optimal way.
Yeah, no, I like that. So you mentioned technical practices earlier. I love this slide that you added to this deck. Can you talk a little bit about the Agile process and engineering practices? And you mentioned kind of a resurgence of talking about the SDLC. What do you see happening out there in terms of kind of Agile and DevOps and the technical practices?
Yeah, so you're going to have to stop me from rambling on this slide because I could go on and on and on here. So my friend that I met at a conference in San Diego last year had this image in his slide deck. His name's Jose Mingarance. You can look him up too. He gave me permission to reuse this. I think it just very intuitively captures what most of us see. Okay, so if an organization only makes investments into agile process, or let's say even business process improvement, in other words, we're streamlining the process of capturing customer and market feedback, and we're funneling that back into the development process rapidly and efficiently and accurately. We're monitoring usage of our products in the marketplace, and we're capturing that as well and bringing all that in. But you don't do anything to improve the way you deliver products to the customers, then you're going to plateau, right? You're only going to squeeze out real, not that much real improvement. And unless you can follow that up with improvements in the way you deliver those technical products, then your organization really can't achieve its true potential. A good way to think about this, and what I like to say a lot of times, is DevOps delivers on the promise that Agile makes. So Agile says, if you incorporate user and market feedback into your development process faster, you will be able to outcompete your opponents and win. And that's really, at the end of the day, I was having drinks with a friend of mine in New York a few weeks ago. We were talking about what is the point of all this stuff? Well, the point is winning, right? So that's what we're trying to say. But I'm saying, if I capture all that feedback, but it takes me 6 months to get those changes that I'm trying to react to out to production, then I'm getting very negligible value from gathering all that information and all this business process improvement that I've made, all this great Agile stuff. We can have stand-ups all day long, but really if I've got what we'll call inventory, which means I've got finished changes or things that really are ready for customers to start interacting with them, takes me 6 months to get that stuff out or 3 months to get that stuff out, I'm really cutting into the value of capturing all that feedback in the first place. Does that make sense so far? I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I'm just disappointed you had drinks without me.
I know, I'm sorry.
But no, that makes
there was a
perfect
machine
sense.
we could just be together all the time.
But it makes so much sense because so many times you see Agile initiatives that look like this slide, right? If you only focus on the process aspects, they take off initially. There's a lot of excitement. You make some progress, productivity grows, right? And you see a lot of progress early. And then those organizations or those teams often plateau. And a lot of times it's for exactly the reason you're mentioning, is because we've gotten what we can get out of the process aspects, but we haven't balanced that with the engineering processes and the technical practices that are going to accelerate it even further.
I'd be willing to bet there's folks on the call that have seen this happen, that have seen leadership say, wow, wait a second, over the last 2 years, we've made millions of dollars of investment into this agile transformation. Where's the return? We don't really seem to be going any faster. I don't see us doing much more than we were able to do before. And then you start digging into the details of that, and it takes you to IT, or it takes you to, the technical folks and the release team. And that's where things start to break down.
Yep. No, fantastic. So let's transition. I know you have a great story to tell about a DevOps transformation you were involved in. Why don't you explain that to the audience, what happened and kind of lessons learned in the DevOps transformation you went through?
Yeah, so we're going to look at the duration of this in a second, but at a high level, there was between 500 and 600 people involved on product teams, globally distributed, organized into about 65 Scrum teams. So there were some obviously supporting folks in there as well, portfolio and whatnot. Supporting 30 financial services products. Those products did all kinds of different things. So many of you have probably read about the IPOs that are happening lately. So some of those products are used by large investment banks to facilitate those IPOs that you're reading about right now or hearing about in the news. Some of them not going swimmingly. That's the bank's fault, not ours. Some of those products would do things like help private companies keep track of their valuation or keep up with who's been issued stock and equity. So all kinds of different products. And from a technology perspective, it was a real spider web. I mean, acquisitive company, so lots of different technology stacks, different operating systems. Most of them, almost all of those products ran out of data centers. And there was a handful of data centers globally distributed again where all those products ran. So when I came on board, I really spent the first month or so just listening to the leadership of the company talk about what they thought the problem was. And we're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but I think that was a really important step because it really led me to a metric that mattered to my company. So for us, what really bothered most people in my company, if you talk to the engineers, you talk to leadership, was how long it took to get stuff out. But not just that, not just how long did it take to get things out into production, to get changes out into production, how much work was involved in getting something out into production. So when I went to the product teams and I listened to them, they would talk about all these things they would have to submit. We call them RFCs, or requests for change. They're always change tickets. And to do one release for a product sometimes would generate a dozen different change requests. They had to track all those different changes through all these different teams in IT. They had to chase people down for approvals, had to go through a change approval board. And it was a very, very manual process. So not only were they having to generate lots of these tickets, the execution of the tickets were all manual as well. And there's really only a couple of teams that could execute those tickets. And so when I looked at the volume of those requests and the friction that was being created, right? So basically, I added up the amount of time that those tickets stayed open. It came up to over 350 person days per month for these tickets. And that's just release activity. That's not all changes in IT. So it was a really significant drain. If we can go to the next slide, I think I can illustrate this a little bit better. The green line here is the number of days of delay. So again, we're looking at the change tickets, the amount of time that they stay open. That's the green line. And the yellow line is just the gross number of tickets. So you can see it peaking there over 950, almost 1,000 changes, just release-related changes in a given month. So that was a metric that resonated with everyone throughout the company. Leadership understood what it meant. So they understood the value in decreasing that number. And certainly our application development teams and application developers understood it. By the way, another good angle to think about here is one of sort of attrition, right? So when I looked at exit interviews from engineers that were regretful, right? Meaning that you wanted to keep these people, but they opted to leave the firm. A lot of them talked about this as just this grind on their productivity and their morale. It's just so difficult to get things done. So again, looking at attrition and thinking about it from that angle, it was really important to the firm that we make it easier to get things done and reduce the friction. That's why this metric was the right one for our organization. The last thing I want to point out about this story before we move on is I really want to drive home the length of time that we're looking at here. This is 3 years of work. So I get a lot of people that come to me at conferences and ask me about, what's this process been like? And I think the little peaks and valleys here tell the story. You can follow these lines down and you can kind of imagine what it must have been like for me, at the end of 2016 when I see that big dip. And I'm like, oh yeah, we got this thing. We're on the home stretch. And then the next month it goes up and you think, oh, what was that, a blip? And then it goes down again, and then it goes way up again. And any metric that you track, buckle up and prepare for weird stuff to happen in these metrics. And you're going to have to dig into the stories to understand what's driving those things. You're going to have I think a lot of people these days want quick fixes. We want to throw Kubernetes at something, and maybe that's going to make all our problems go away. It just doesn't work that way in real life. You're going to grind through. You're going to get some wins, you're going to make some progress, and it'll plateau, and then it might even go in the other direction. And when those things happen, you can't, you got to resist the temptation to overreact. You got to dig into the deep details. You got to understand the story behind the data. There might be a metric that you need to add in that you're looking at. Maybe 1 or 2 metrics is enough. You got to build a better picture. So just that patience bit is something I really wanted to stress to folks, understanding that even in a relatively small to medium-sized company with only 30 products, it's a 3-year transformation. It involves organizational change, and it involves a lot of patience. And I'm not a patient person by any stretch of the imagination. This was the biggest bureaucratic move I've ever pushed, and it was hard for me to be patient this whole time, but it was worth it.
So you mentioned some lessons learned. You mentioned being patient. 2, that it's going to take a lot of time. 3 is when you're collecting metrics, they do go up and down. So, you have to look at it kind of in the bigger picture. Do you have any other, couple of lessons learned that you got out of this transformation that you could share, particularly around, Agile leaders and their involvement, or what you observed happened during this transformation? Anything else you want to comment on?
Yeah, it's probably, I think it's a good time to kind of underpin a hypothesis here. So we've talked a lot about sort of the relationship between DevOps and Agile so far. And usually what I've seen is if there's a company going through an Agile transformation, they're probably also trying to do DevOps. What I'm a little concerned about is that those things tend to be driven from 2 different groups inside an organization. And that concerns me for a couple of reasons. One is they're very codependent, and the value of a DevOps transformation, I think, is multiplied by getting better at Agile. And as we've already established, I don't think you're really going to achieve your goals in an Agile transformation unless you make some improvements to the technical processes. I just don't think that's going to work. And so I'm concerned at this trend that I see where we have this schism almost, where there's lots of people going out and getting Agile certifications. A lot of people that don't have hard technical backgrounds, that don't understand sort of what some of these technical challenges are and what some of these metrics really mean. And then they're off doing their thing, competing for mind share. And this is the thing that I think is dangerous. They're competing for mind share, and the minds of the leadership of the companies deciding how to make investments, deciding where to spend time and where to put attention. And then you've got technical folks who really kind of think hold the linchpin for huge improvements in how a company can actually operate in terms of getting rid of this friction and really accelerating the company. And they're off to the side trying to get some of that mind share. What I see is that technical people generally are not very good at influencing others outside of the technical field. It's a soft skill. Most technical folks don't have it. It's not something they work on very hard. most of the folks I find in the Agile side actually naturally have that skill. They're very good at convincing other people to try something different or to try a different approach. So anyway, so the Agile folks are really natural good influencers. I think if we can pull these two groups together, we can do some really amazing stuff. But that means that both sides have to learn a little bit and flex a little bit. What worked really well for us is that we did have an Agile leader who was very tuned in, and that was actually Mary Thorne. Many of you probably know her. So she was sort of my partner in crime and all this stuff. And I wouldn't have been successful without Mary, and she wouldn't have been successful without me. And so by keeping us, we literally had our desks, side by side or right across from each other. We talked every day. We worked very closely on all these things, collaborated very closely. So I never had to compete with Mary for mind share. And in fact, most of the leadership of the company always thought of us as sort of like two peas in a pod. We were like the two halves of the conversation. And, they would ask Mary, well, what does Lee think? Or they'd ask me, what does Mary think? They thought of us as colleagues that were driving the transformation of the company, not the Agile transformation and the DevOps transformation. I think we worked really well together on that stuff. And so I think that's another bit of advice and my basic hypothesis, and the reason I was excited about this webinar is I really want to start to try and pull those conversations back together. Another kind of thing to consider here is if you go back and look at the signers of the Agile Manifesto, they were all, for the most part, really hardcore technical developers. They came from XP, they were software engineers. Many of them today run really hardcore software engineering blogs if they're still active. And so they had a really good understanding of the technical side. They branched out to try and consider bigger problems in their organizations, and where they saw weakness was on the process side, on the Agile side, what became the Agile movement, right? But along the way, we've lost some of that. I think we saw a lot of people who were project managers, whatnot, get very interested in this other way to do things. They came over from portfolio or project management, and we've lost a little bit of that technical attention in the Agile movement. And I kind of want to bring us back to that. And I think really as a movement, that's what DevOps is just trying to bring us full circle.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. So how do you see Agile leaders being able to influence DevOps change? You mentioned you and Mary worked very closely together, and she was coming from the Agile side. You were responsible for the DevOps side. Talk a little bit about the different roles and how we get Agile leaders and DevOps leaders to kind of work together in transformation.
Yeah, so let's talk about definition of done. I mean, this is something that I see a lot of organizations struggle with, is trying to get this definition of done. And it's interesting to me. So what we did, what you can do, and I think what Agile coaches can do, is push teams to include, good technical doneness as well as, what we would think of as sort of user-facing doneness. I saw a good one on Twitter the other day, and it basically said, done means that it's in production and it's instrumented and we're collecting telemetry, meaning that it's fully deployed and I have automated systems in place that are telling me whether it's healthy and how it's being used. And there's a lot of implications in that stack, in that definition, which means, I've thought about monitoring and I've thought about how I'm going to deploy it, and all that stuff is included in that definition of done. And that's something I think the Agile coaches, if they can kind of get plugged into that technical side of things, if you're not already, is a good way you can help. Scrum Masters, where I see this really coming into play is during grooming and planning meetings, when teams are talking about how they're going to get a certain piece of work done. And there's red flags that if you know what to listen for, you can really help your teams. If someone says, man, I think that database change is going to be really painful to deploy, and the response is, well, we're just going to have to deal with it. That's not necessarily a solution. What you're doing is you're introducing a lot of deployment friction into whatever change it is that you're talking about, whatever feature you're building. So a Scrum Master could push a little bit on the team in those cases and say, hey, is there another way to break this work down so that we don't have to do this database change at the same time as the code change? Is there a way for us to slowly change the database over a couple of deployments and disconnect it from the code so we are decreasing risk and complexity, so we can roll back if we need to, or we can maybe test something a little bit differently. Sometimes developers can get a little bit pigeonholed in how they think about database evolution, And so a Scrum Master that's a little bit more technically inclined or aware of that and push a little bit more to break that work down in a more granular way. POs, again, at the end of the day, a product owner should own prioritization of work. So understanding the value of a technical project or a technical change and figuring out how to balance that against all the user-facing improvements that are on the backlog is really important. And I see a lot of POs that, and it's not a criticism of them personally, it's just they're just not aware. And again, technical folks in the team may not be great influencers or very great storytellers. And so while there might be really valuable work in the backlog that the developers are trying to fight for, they're having a hard time defining it, and they're having a hard time talking about the value of it. So if POs were a little bit more plugged into what we're going to talk about in a second with these metrics, then I think that there's an opportunity there where they can help build that bridge to the developers as well.
No, I like that. So I know you're writing a book on all this stuff, Lee, and you don't want to plug it, obviously, but I'm going to plug it. So I know you're writing a book on all of this, and it also ties into the metrics. And that metrics is a key part of this. It sounds like what you're saying is, Agile really needs to kind of reach across the table almost and start talking about some of its things like definition of done and other things in the context of delivery. If I'm hearing what you're saying. And vice versa, DevOps needs to be thinking about the round trip, right? We're going to talk about metrics. here's the results. So cycle time does look like it's the most popular. So is none. Business coverage, code coverage, things like that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Definitely
cycle time I think is very useful and is certainly something that seems to be measured a lot.
Yeah. I like somebody put code coverage in chat. That's a good one too. I mean, again, it's about incentive, right, Jeff? So if you've got an issue where you look at it and you say, wow, we just don't have enough automated test coverage, well, making that metric really public and visible is a good way to send a message that you care about it, and seeing it go up is good.
Yep. A couple of resources for those that are on the call. If you're not familiar with Accelerate, State of the DevOps report, it surveys a large set of organizations on their DevOps practices, categorizes them into low, high, and now even elite. And it gives you some measures of what the average metrics are for organizations of different levels of maturity in DevOps across these different common DevOps metrics. Great way to benchmark yourself and see where you're at. There's a lot of other information in this report. It is available for free from DORA, the organization, DevOps organization, research organization. I encourage you to look into that information. There's also another report out there that is also free that I encourage you to look at, which is the Puppet State of the DevOps report. And two things that are in here that I think you might find interesting that are germane to this conversation. One is here on the left, they have a kind of a maturity / transformation process that they recommend you follow. I mean, Lee and I were talking about this last week, and I think we agree that this process that's been described here is really for a particular team or stack, right? Not across your entire enterprise necessarily, mainly because it's really difficult to normalize a technology stack typically across a large-scale enterprise. But I also found it interesting what percentage of organizations on the right were starting to or were automating their collection and use of metrics to both technical / system metrics and tying those to business value. Any thoughts on that, Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I see everybody struggle with that too. We certainly do here at IHS. I mean, we're doing it through two different channels right now. One is a little bit more mature, and we just use Power BI, suck in all the metrics that way. But we're starting to experiment with Capital One's Hygia project. So it's an open source project. It's a little bit young. It's kind of not quite polished and productized yet, but it does seem to work. We've had some early successes with it, so we're hoping to do more.
That's great. Yeah, we've used Hygia as well. I think it's a promising product. We're going to answer questions, but before we do, just a couple of things. Thank you for attending the webinar. If interested, Lee and I are actually both going to be at Agile DevOps West in a couple of weeks here. If you type in the discount code shown here, you can save 20%. We do have a bunch of courses around Agile and DevOps, make you aware of a few. One is we have a live virtual version of our Foundations of DevOps coming up at the end of May. If you're interested in registering, there's a link here. And we do have a fairly new course called DevOps Leadership Workshop that gets to some of the things we're talking about here in terms of helping stakeholders and senior executives understand what it takes to get through a transformation process and what DevOps really means for an enterprise. And check that out if you can as well. The last thing I'll note before we answer questions is we will be continuing this conversation on the TechWell Hub. So I'm going to actually head over to the Hub after this is over. If anybody wants to ask additional questions above and beyond what we cover here, jump on the Hub at any time. This QR code will get you right there if you're interested in learning more about the Hub or using the Hub.
I'll hang over there for a little bit too.
Yeah, so Lee's going to join as well. So questions, things we can answer, other thoughts, comments?
Yes, we had a couple of admin-related questions about the presentation, so I'm going to go back to the lobby so those attendees can download.
Yeah, so Pam is asking about regulated companies and how to automate deployments. So a lot of regulated companies have a requirement called segregation of duties or separation of responsibilities. And what that means is that typically what it means is if I'm a software developer, I can't have the ability to make a change and push that all the way to production on my own. Like I can't have that ability. So again, different companies are going to have slightly different rules around that stuff, but that's basically what it means. The good news is that deployment automation tools have matured, and now most of them will have the ability to insert manual approval steps in the gate. So there's a couple of things you have to do here. One is you have to make sure you permission the configuration of the pipeline itself so that I can't unilaterally, as a developer, make a change to it and then remove that gate, right? So that would kind of break the process. And then second thing is make sure you have those gates there, and those gates can be configured to require approval from a non-developer. So you set up a different group, you put your PO in it, or maybe all the POs in it, and then when I, commit a change and I execute that pipeline, it's going to hit that manual approval step, send an email or whatever to the Slack message or something to the PO. PO would then go into the tool, review the change, and then approve it or reject it. If they approve it, it allows the pipeline to move on to the next phase. You might put those manual approval steps, in front of a customer-facing staging environment and then in front of production, but you wouldn't need them necessarily in front of QA. And so you'd use those gates as a way to make sure you keep that regulation there. And typically those tools are pretty auditable as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often do this. We do a lot of work in the regulated space and environments, both commercial and federal. And we usually set up what I think you're describing, Lee. We call push button deployment, which is where you set it up so that there is a manual acceptance step that is obviously authenticated to whoever it is has approval authority, and they go in and make sure everything is good and copacetic, and then they have the ability to push into staging or production or whatever it is, and everything thereafter is automated. That's one key thing is people often we see misunderstand. Just because there's a manual step doesn't mean that the deployment is manual, right? I mean, it just means you're going to stop and pause and wait for someone to hit go. You're still going to automate your deployment process to make sure it's as efficient as possible. How can my team make sure my team has skills?
Yes, how can I make sure my team has the skills they need? That's a great question. So this is another area where I'm pretty passionate. I'll plug another one of my tools or another one of my projects, Jeff. tekata.io, tekata.io is a free online tool you can use that will help you do a skill matrix, a skill gap analysis for your team. And basically what you got to do is you have to identify what are the skills the team needs to be successful and what do we have currently, and then make a plan. This is another one of those things that you can easily bake into your sort of monthly regular cadence, talk about it at retrospectives, reevaluate, quarterly. I've used some tricks like if we identify a pretty significant gap, and I've had this happen to me with some of the teams I've managed, we see this big gap, and it's some key area of our application, right? It's like the login process or something. And there's only one person on our team that is an expert with it. That's a risk. It means that it's really hard to estimate work related to that system. It's really difficult to execute work related to that system. If another team has a dependency on us to get something done in a certain amount of time, that's a very risky thing. So cross-team dependencies can get made much worse by those kind of key person dependencies. So using Tekata, you can kind of identify that stuff. And then what we would do is make a plan and say, all right, well, this month, that person who's currently the expert is not allowed to do any work on that system. Instead, these two other people are going to do the work, and that expert is really just there to consult and to help them. And we're going to do that for the next 3 months. And our goal is to get these two other people's level of expertise up to, the midpoint or maybe even better. And by doing that, we're trading off a little bit of possibly short-term velocity for massively de-risking the team. And you can do that, and I recommend that you do that with any skill area on the team. You don't want to have areas where there's just one person who knows how to do something. That's another thing that I see happen with DevOps transformations pretty frequently is one person on the team steps up and says, oh, I'll set up the continuous integration process. Oh, and then I'll set up the deployment process. Oh, and then I'll set up this integration. And at the end of the day, they become this great DevOps engineer with all this fantastic expertise, and then they leave your company and go join somebody else and double their salary, right? Now they're a senior DevOps engineer, and you've just really gotten yourself into a sticky situation. So as you go through these transformations, pay close attention to how those skill dependencies and key person dependencies are evolving. And you can use Takata or just use a spreadsheet. It doesn't matter to me. The important thing is keep up with where those dependencies are and purposefully structure work around reducing those risks. You can use pair programming. You can use, like what I said, those tricks where you kind of force other people to do the work by using queues or whatnot. You can force people to do documentation. This gets into a whole other area of like psychology that I won't get into, but it is definitely something to keep a close eye on.
What you're saying is obviously you don't want anything really in your process to be something that only one person knows how to do. It's too risky.
Yeah, and you got to make trade-offs sometimes, right? I mean, you have to be practical at the same time, but I think, and what Takata allows you to do is kind of reorder your skills. So you kind of keep those most critical things at the top, and Takata will score skills based on their priority. So if you have something at the top with one person who's really good at it, you're going to get a low score. Because Takata is saying, hey, look, if it's that important, it's at the very top of your list, you definitely don't want to have just one person that's good at it. If at the bottom of the list, it's not a super critical skill, then okay, maybe we can get away with some of that. And so focus your effort on those critical skills. But you're gonna have to accept some level of risk, but definitely, especially with things like a DevOps transformation, be careful about allowing one person to really control all of that stuff. Most critical DevOps skills now. It's interesting. It's a really great question, Patricia. Thanks for asking that. What are my thoughts on that? I think, honestly, that this sort of influx of DevSecOps or SecDevOps, or however you want to split that up, is really, really fascinating. More and more in my career, I really appreciate true information security specialists, like people who that's in their DNA. They think about it. They think about internal bad actors. They think about, how could this go wrong? How could this be exploited? And having that sort of thought process and that skill set of understanding different aspects of like Cypher technology and that sort of thing, and understanding how can I automate security certificate deployments as part of my DevOps processes, my automation pipelines. That's really valuable stuff. And not very many people know that stuff very well. So to me, I think when I think about especially bigger organizations, having people in your organization that understand that really well is super valuable, super critical.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I would say understanding and knowing containerization and orchestration of those kinds of things has become really popular. We had John Willis. He was the keynoter last November at the Agile DevOps East Conference. One of the things he said that really resonated with me was he kind of views orchestration, so cloud-based orchestration tools like Kubernetes as kind of the next generation of an operating system, so to speak, because they're really scheduling and servicing jobs and services, like an operating system would, right? And his vision is that in a cloud world where you have services and they get spun up and spun down and they get controlled and orchestrated, that orchestrators are the new operating systems. And to me, that means that that's an important thing for people to know and understand. What do you think about that?
I agree at a high level. I'll say this about Kubernetes. I have a love-hate relationship with Kubernetes. I think you and I have talked about this, Jeff.
We did, yep. I brought it up.
So, I think that the number of companies that actually need to take on the complexity of Kubernetes is much smaller than the number of companies that are trying to do that. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important for companies and organizations to focus on the outcome they're trying to achieve. What are we trying to do here? Okay, great. We've containerized our application. We've got this really slick automation stuff. Somebody comes forward and says, hey, I think we should use Kubernetes to orchestrate all of these, to create our operating system. Okay, yes, you need some kind of orchestration, but let's talk about what that orchestration needs to do and how much of that is only doable by Kubernetes versus can I use, if I'm deploying it to the cloud anyway, can I use EKS? Can I use ECS? Can I use a simpler tool? Somebody else is managing that layer for me. I don't want to have to do that myself, right? So yes, I think the operating system analogy is great. I just think that some of these technologies are very young, they're highly complicated, and taking on that operational complexity is a big jump. So you've got all this stuff that's changing already. Be careful about how much of that complexity you take on, and make smart trade-offs around what you really need today, and what you can get by with.
Yeah, no, and I think that was John Wallace's point. I don't know that he was pushing Kubernetes in particular. He was pushing the idea of, orchestration of services being the next generation of an operating system in a cloud.
I actually think that the serverless stuff is really fascinating to me. I mean, that's almost like jumped a few steps ahead of where container orchestration is going and solving even more of that problem for you.
So I know we're over time. We should probably conclude the webinar. If anybody is interested in commenting or discussing any of these things further, as we mentioned, we're going to jump over to the TechWell Hub for a bit and continue this conversation there. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you at our next webinar.